He portrays himself and tries to call himself Mr. Right. Mr. Right.
We got a strong team. Jason Lewis, ready to contribute, ready to fight for what's best for this country. Jason Lewis. Thank you and God bless you. Jason Lewis. He rode a blazing saddle. He wore a shining star. His job to offer battle to bad men near and far. He conquered fear and he conquered hate. He turned dark night into day. He made his blazing saddle a torch to light the way.
You've heard me say frequently, it really doesn't matter how the government finances its operations. It all comes out of the private economy. It is the budget that's the problem, whether you tax, inflate, or borrow. However method you choose to finance government spending, it comes out of the private sector. Therefore, if we just reduce the debt, but we don't cut back spending, we will have merely traded debt for increases in taxes. And if we just keep taxes low, but we don't reduce spending, we will have traded taxes for massive increases in debt. The key is spending, which is why I'm glad there's a new group out there focusing on just that. It's called the Coalition to Reduce Spending. The mission is to advocate for reductions in federal spending and balanced budgets. And I'm all for balanced budgets, don't get me wrong, but you've got to get there the right way. And so, therefore, this group, which is talking about the tiniest amounts of spending across the board, is one worthy of your support. Joining us now is the president of the group, Jonathan Bydlak. He's a former director of fundraising for Ron Paul's 2008 bid, chiefly via raising funds, I say, chiefly via online and social media, that sort of thing. He now is also with Bydlak and Associates, a consulting firm, working with clients in political races to advocate, well, just what I said, reductions in spending. Jonathan, welcome to the Jason Lewis Show.
Thanks a lot for having me.
It really is the key, and it's sort of Econ 101, but for many, many years you had supply-siders, and it's true, all things being equal, if you have the right kind of tax reductions, pro-growth tax reductions, you will not lose as much revenue as the naysayers would say, and sometimes with capital gains you might even gain revenue. But if you don't focus on spending, cutting taxes and spending, you're going to increase debt, and now we've got this massive debt of which no supply-sider would argue credibly that you can grow out of. The flip side of that, Jonathan, is now these quote-unquote new Democrats who all of a sudden have discovered the balanced budget, when that's really just a ruse for their real plan to raise taxes, and so they say, well, we got to focus on the debt. Spending doesn't matter, it's just the debt. And so if we raise taxes to close the debt, why, we're just fine. Both groups are wrong to that degree, are they not?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, when you look back in the 80s, there was sort of this philosophy that was out there called starve the beast, right? And the theory was if we basically take away the revenue from the federal government, that'll provide the incentive to cut spending. Of course, we now know pretty clearly that didn't work because, as you said earlier, government can just borrow and or print more money. And so what we've ended up with is instead of promoting high spending and raising taxes to pay for it, we've just had high spending and run big budget deficits. And of course, that creates inflation and huge other economic problems. And so, I think that this is why now, you sort of see the tide changing a little bit with the Tea Party movement, which, say what you will, at the end of the day, there's more of a focus on spending and on balancing the budget by reducing spending. And so,
well, we do have some evidence. We do have some evidence of that because there's this new report out. Where was this from? The Pew Center today, that found that our pension liabilities, our state pensions, these are the promised retirement benefits, health care benefits to government workers, those pension liabilities are now approaching $1 trillion. $1 trillion. Now, folks, that's a whole lot of money by anybody's calculation, and yet, if you look at Wisconsin, if you look at San Diego, you look at San Jose, the taxpayer has risen up and said, you know what? You're going to have to live just like the rest of us live if you work for government. That might be a good sign.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of times people don't even realize the full extent of the problem. I mean, when we talk about a $1.3 trillion budget deficit, or we talk about a $15.7 trillion national debt, I mean, those numbers are, very difficult to sort of wrap your head around. But the thing that's even more unbelievable is that, there are plenty of estimates out there now that if you basically take the present value of all of the promises and all the future obligations that the federal government has made, our projected national debt is actually $100 trillion. And so, this is a massive problem. And, there's a study that came out recently by a professor at Harvard that basically talked about the national debt as a percentage of GDP and the effect that has on growth rates. And what he basically found was that when the national debt goes above about 90%, you start to see growth suffer pretty dramatically. Well, there was a CBO report that came out last week that talked about, our national debt right now, just recently in the last year, passed 100% of GDP, and our public debt is about 70%. But the CBO report talked about the fact that they are now projecting that our public debt will, in the next 20 to 25 years, be over 200% of GDP.
Well, that would be uncharted territory. But we have reached 102% out of World War II. We had 100 right. Coming out of World War II. Our debt to GDP was 102% of the national economy.
Right. Of course, that was a very temporary sort of, temporary circumstances. What we're seeing now, there's, unless we sort of change course, there's really no signs that the situation right. we're in now is really going to change. And of course,
we demilitarized after World War II, and federal spending went to 15%. You had this buildup for World War II that we immediately cut way back on in 1945 after victory. So. The difference clearly is that spending that could be jettisoned. Now this spending is built in entitlements and growing. Nobody's talking about cutting back, and therein lies the problem.
Absolutely, and of course, to add to that, I mean, people are proposing new spending all the time. It's as you said, we have these programs where these promises are being made, and it's spending is consistently increasing.
When you say, Jonathan, when you say coalition to reduce spending, the new group that you're running, where's the coalition? I understand there's a coalition to cut taxes. I understand there's a coalition to increase spending. I understand there's a coalition for a big military budget, coalition for more discrimination lawsuits, the trial bar. There's coalitions for lots of things, but a coalition to just say no to your own largesse, where is that?
Well, I think you'd be surprised, So first of all, there are, if you want to start with elected officials, right, there are a handful of people who are advocating for reducing spending. I think about, Senator Rand Paul. I think about Tom Coburn. I think about Mosh from Michigan. We have, Tom McClintock in California. We have various people who are sort of champions of this cause. Now, of course, it's not a majority. And, even though when you look at polling data, among conservatives and independents, it actually is a majority. And even among Democrats, when you ask the question, do you believe that the budget should be balanced? Over 50% of Democrats in most polls show that, they're in favor of balancing the budget. And so, that's something that
they're in favor of raising taxes to balance the budget.
Agrees with. It's just that the elected officials generally don't.
Yeah, you got to be careful on the balanced budget thing. The supply-siders had a point there. If all we do to balance the budget is raise taxes, then you're going to crowd out capital just through taxation instead of borrowing, and you're going to have the same deleterious effects. You've got to balance the budget the right way.
Yeah, absolutely, and again, the thing is, when people talk about the notion of balancing the budget by raising taxes, the fact is the numbers just don't add up. You could raise taxes to 100%, and you're still not going to have enough to even close the budget deficit, let alone start paying down the outstanding national debt. So that's sort of the message that we're trying to get across to people is that, if you're serious about balancing the budget, the only way to do so is by cutting spending. That's just sort of the mathematics of it. There's really no way around that.
I often point out to people, would you rather have a federal budget of $4 trillion and balanced, or a federal budget of $500 billion with, say, $100 billion in deficit spending? Well, obviously the answer is the latter, even though you have a deficit, because, as Rand Paul points out, and his dad, it's the spending that counts. And I want to come back to this coalition to reduce spending a bit and explore that with you a little bit more. Jonathan Bydlak is the president of a new group called Coalition to Reduce Spending, right here on the Jason Lewis Show. If you think the problem problem, as I do, is spending. That's it in a nutshell. I don't care whether it's Europe, America, or any other country with financial problems, then you might like this group. It's called the Coalition to Reduce Spending, talking with its president, Jonathan Bydlak. Jonathan, how did the groups come to be? Where was the genesis?
Yeah, it was sort of accidental. It's just sort of been an idea that we've had for a while, and it just seemed like the political mood of the country right now is such that a group like this is really needed. And when you look around, there are groups that talk about spending, but they talk about it in the context that are along with another 8 million other issues. And so our theory was that the groups that tend to be most effective at advocating for change are those who have a very focused mission. And there really wasn't another group out there that was solely advocating for reducing spending, and so hence the coalition.
You mentioned a few of the real spending cutters. I think Coburn and his new book, The Debt Bomb, is very impressive. And, of course, the Pauls and McClintock and a few other California Congress. I would add Jim DeMint.
Right.
But you look also at what has come to be known as big government conservatism, something coming out of the Bush years and certainly valid criticism. I would take the Farm Bill. You've got so-called Republicans like John Thune or Marco Rubio or Roy Blunt. You could go right down the list, and they're in favor of the sugar beet quota, the sugar beet program. Now, you've got Charles Grassley and Tom Harkin going hand in hand singing Kumbaya over renewing target price supports. And, of course, I haven't even mentioned the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned us about. And you now have a number of Republicans who say it's better to raise taxes than to let sequestration, which would be a modest cut off of a $700 billion a year Pentagon budget, about $50 billion a year for 10 years. They would rather raise taxes than do that. So when everybody's got their own special little group, how do you ever get a handle around this? The Democrats want to raise spending on everything, but as long as they know the Republicans will accept defense, the Democrats want to raise, and the Republicans want to raise defense and a few other things, as long as they know the other side wants something, they end up bargaining.
Right. And so I think what you're pointing out is that, anyone can basically say they're for smaller government or limited government. But at the end of the day, it's their actions that matter. And so, the problem that I see is that you have people who run for office and they say, yeah, of course, I'm for smaller government. And they get into office and they do something completely different. And, we mentioned a few of the exceptions to that. So I think that the solution starts by putting candidates for office on the record and basically defining what it means to be for smaller government so that, it's not, well, they get into office and you don't really have any way of holding them accountable. Here you can say very clearly, well, remember back when you were running, you said very specifically that you supported, plank X, Y, and Z. And now you're not following that. And so it's sort of like, when you have financial commentators on TV and they kind of predict the stock market's going to go up or down, and then when it doesn't do what they said it was going to do, there's no real way to hold them accountable because they're off making their next prediction. And so I think there needs to be a very clear way of putting people on the record and holding them accountable for what it is that they
So what you're saying is we've got to have a paradigm shift where instead of buying votes, so you want the teachers union, you give more money to education, you want to keep the base open in your congressional district, you'll get rewarded with votes and all of this. Instead of making that a political necessity, make spending cuts a political necessity. That is, make certain there's a political cost for increasing spending because there's a coalition to reduce it that's so large that they're going to take it out on you if you don't.
Absolutely. Well, again, going back to what I said earlier, there's clearly a sea change occurring in the electorate. And when you look at, again, support among independents for balancing the budget, and we can, obviously there are different proposals on how to do that. But the point is that people understand, regardless of their political stripe, that this is a problem. And so, to some degree, if we don't have political action on this issue, then, we're going to be really find ourselves between a rock and a hard
but Europe
place.
had warnings years ago, and the spending machine just kept going and going. I'll give you another example. I am trying to challenge you a little bit on whether or not this can get done. I don't want to be too pessimistic here, but if you take a look, I've talked about these three ideas or these three points in the last, I'd say, week or two about reining in pensions, especially on public safety pensions, because they're out of control in places like San Jose, even for firefighters and cops. I've talked about getting a handle on the military-industrial complex. And, of course, I've talked about farm programs. And I can tell you flat out, Jonathan, that I've got emails from so-called conservatives on all three of those saying, gee, Jason, I usually like your program, and I'm conservative, but In every one of those cases, they wanted the pensions to continue, the farm subsidies to continue, and, of course, military spending to go up. So where's the coalition?
Well, and so that's where I think that making the intellectual case really matters. You know, there are groups that advocate for various things, but I think a lot of times they fail because they don't really make they don't present the persuasive case as to why you should be supportive of the things that they're advocating for. So it's one thing to say, you know, I want smaller government and therefore we should cut spending. But if you don't necessarily want smaller government in all instances, or think you want smaller government in all instances, you're not really going to be convinced. And so another part of what we're trying to do is basically make that intellectual case and say, you know, here's why you should be supporting cutting spending. Here's why cutting spending is valuable. Here's why cutting spending is good for you and your neighbor.
Right.
And so that, I think, is a big part of the component. You know,
an educational component here, right? Absolutely.
So when the president, you know, gets on TV and says, you know, it's commonly accepted that we need a stimulus plan, you know, it's and that's great, but it's very nice to be able to hit back and say, well, actually, as a matter of fact, here's 300 scholars and academics who disagree with you. And so when someone says, well, we need to spend X, Y, or Z more, we need to raise taxes or what have you, it's very nice to be able to come back and say, well, actually, here are academics, here are scholars, here are people who study this thing for a living who have a totally different opinion from that perspective. And so I think that will ultimately make our advocacy work far more successful if we're able to make that intellectual case and take it to the people. And, you know,
I'm telling somebody on Social Security, guess what? If you don't do anything, and I like privatizing a portion of it for people under a certain age, if you don't do something, your Social Security is going to get cut because there won't be any money. So
absolutely.
You have no choice. The cuts are coming one way or another. The question is whether you want to have a seat at the table.
Well, and you know, and I think that the average person on the street, this is a very common sense idea, right? If you say to someone, you know, look, you're spending $40,000 more a year than you're earning at your job. Do you go and say, you know, and you say, well, what do you need to do in that situation? Well, the response is always going to be, I need to cut back on my spending. And it's not going to be, you know, I need to get rid of the Starbucks coffee every morning. It's going to be, I need to think seriously about my expenses, and I need to get my own, you know, home's fiscal house in order. And so, you know, I think that, again, like that's the one thing that our side, the side that wants to reduce spending has working in its favor, is that it's very intuitive. People grasp very, very easily, you know, the notion that, well, we're spending way more than we're taking in, we've got to cut back what we're spending. And in many ways,
I hope you're right. Simple. I hope you're right, but that usually works right up until you get to their subsidy.
Right.
And that's what we've got to overcome. Let's come back and continue this conversation. I want to talk about raising taxes and why that's not an option, as well as how serious a situation are we in under this president in the time, as Rand Paul has done, to say, you know what, Romney may not be perfect, but we're in a world of hurt here. We'll continue right after this. I guess some people, Jonathan Bydlak, president of Coalition to Reduce Spending, some people like to rely on this old shibboleth about just raising taxes on the rich. There are a myriad of problems with this, and I think when you talk about educating the American people, that the money is just not there. The top 10% pay 70% of all the income taxes. The top 1% alone pay 40%. I suppose one could say, well, let's take the other 60%. But the problem is a matter of numbers. If indeed you confiscated all of the taxable income of all the millionaires and billionaires in the country, that would yield about $938 billion, according to the IRS data. So if you took all the money of millionaires and billionaires, you wouldn't generate but a fourth of 1 year's federal budget.
Right.
You wouldn't even generate enough money to close the deficit.
Right, let alone start paying down the national debt. So you have no choice but to look at spending. It's really that simple.
It really is that simple. And when you consider that the federal budget has gone up 65% just since 2005 and has really escalated under this particular president, you see where the problem lies in spending, not revenue. Now, you know, as long as there's a dime left, somebody's going to say raise taxes on the rich. What they don't understand is behavior will change. You know, and don't get me wrong, Clinton proved you can raise taxes and get more revenue in certain cases. But 9 times out of 10, when you get more revenue, you get lower growth. And so the American people have to come to realize they shouldn't be as concerned with the government's finances as they are with their own. By that I mean, if you have lower taxes in general, you may have lower revenue to the government, but who cares if you've got higher economic growth in the private sector?
Right. It's interesting that you brought up Bill Clinton because, most people sort of recognize the economy did reasonably well in the 90s.
Right.
And, not to say that spending didn't still go up during Clinton. But one of the things that's interesting is that, we did reap the peace dividend, post the Cold War in the 1990s. And the same thing happened, of course, after World War II, where we dramatically cut spending and, the economy did not go off a cliff. And as a matter of fact, we prospered pretty much unlike any time in the last century. And so you have a couple of these examples, right, in relatively recent history where spending was cut pretty significantly and, we were the better for it. And so, again,
you take a look at the last 4 or 5 presidents, spending went up the least under Clinton. Now, I would argue that Clinton was a smart politician and realized which way the wind was blowing and also had a Republican Congress, so maybe there's something to divided government. But that's a fact, and the economy did well. You can also look at 1981-82. When Reagan deregulated, cut taxes, and told Volcker to keep a lid on the money supply. And all of a sudden, we had a sharp contraction, but we got out of it in robust growth in the early 80s, 1920 and 21. We've had these examples you cite, and right now, under this president, and this is where I want to go, because as bad as Bush was, this guy's doubling or tripling down, we're doing the exact opposite of all those historical examples.
Well, and I think the most disconcerting thing more than all of that is that the president is proposing a budget that doesn't even balance. It's one thing to, all right, there's increases in entitlement spending that's built in and that sort of thing. We can talk about all that. But, when you can't actually say that you're getting serious about the deficit or the debt, if you're not even proposing a budget that's shown to balance. And that's, again, getting back to the things that need to change. There needs to be political pressure, so that people who are in office, whether it's the president or whether it's people in Congress, are getting serious about addressing these issues. And, to me, there's a reason why, not a single Republican or Democrat voted for the president's budget. And that's because, it wasn't serious at all. And so, that I think if you really want to point to one thing that's symbolic, that would be the easiest thing in my mind.
A balanced budget.
Yeah, we can talk about, the Paul Ryan budget and Rand Paul's budget and all these other budgets, right? But, at the very least, these budgets are shown to balance, right? And we can talk about whether it's fast enough or it's too slow or whatever else. But the president put forth a budget that did not even in the time frame that revenues and expenditures were projected out, never came into balance. And so, this, right? What that basically means is that we would just be continuing deficit spending out for another 30 plus years. Not even touching the national debt that we have outstanding and just continuing to add to that. And, you can ask the question, why is that a problem, right? And this gets back to really needing to make the case, people. The reason it's a problem is because interest rates are at historical lows. And interest as a share, interest on the debt, is relatively low compared to what it could be if interest rates moved up even to historical averages.
Which they eventually will.
Right. And so if you're proposing to continue deficit spending for 30 to 40 more years, not even touching the national debt that we already have outstanding, and then considering that interest rates are likely to rise during that period, that's a massive problem. Most estimates, show that the interest on the debt alone, in the next 20 years will be greater than the entire expense of the Social Security program. And so, that's a massive problem that needs to be addressed. And, you can sweep that under the rug, but at some point the economic reality is going to come back and we're not going to have a choice but to deal with it. And at that point, the medicine is just going to be much more.
Well, why don't groups like yours and the spending cutters rejoice over sequestration? Sequestration, the so-called fiscal cliff, which is scheduled to kick in January as a result of raising the debt ceiling, simply says we're going to take $1 trillion out for a decade, which is peanuts when you look at $47 trillion in spending over a decade.
Right.
But that's a start. And somebody ought to be saying, certainly, and I talked to Tom Coburn about this a couple of weeks ago, and he agreed, somebody ought to be saying, great, you know what, we can't get our heads together here. We'll let sequestration take effect. What's not to like here? Automatic spending cuts.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that, right? Again, it really comes down to, when you look at the mathematics of the situation that we need to reduce spending. And so, ideally, look, you want to be a little more, I guess maybe this is too ideal for politicians, but you want to be able to say, all right, we see that this problem exists and we need to do something serious and plan out how we're exactly going to go and solve this problem. But, given that no one really wants to take the lead or that we don't have a majority right now who are able to take the lead, then yeah, I think I have no problem with the idea of having automatic spending cuts kick in.
Now, the Deficit Commission, of which Coburn was a part, and others, I thought came up with some pretty good ideas. There seems to be this, inside the Beltway where you reside, this sort of internecine battle between Grover Norquist or Tom Coburn over what constitutes a tax increase. And so if the Deficit Commission comes up with a plan to say, the mortgage interest deduction or the earned income tax credit or the ethanol tax credit ought to be repealed. And therefore, those people's taxes will go up. They will be paying more than they otherwise would. However, rates aren't going up. And in some cases, my rates might go down because those people are now paying more. Is that a tax increase, or is that something that should be on the table?
Yeah, no, I do think it should be on the table, right? I'm in agreement with Senator Coburn in that debate personally.
Yeah.
As an organization, we don't really take a position on it, but I think the reality is that, there are many aspects to tax policy, right? And the aggregate level of tax revenue is but one factor. And so, we can acknowledge, for example, let's say that Congress decided that they were going to pass a law tomorrow that said, we're going to keep everyone's taxes the same, but we're going to lower Charlie Rangel's taxes to zero. Right. I think every conservative, every American will look at that situation and understand that that's patently not just unfair, but doesn't make good economic sense. And so you can understand that even though that kind of law might actually lower the total tax revenue coming into the federal government, that would not be wise tax policy. And so I think a similar, in my personal opinion, is with respect to things like ethanol subsidies or what have you, or the mortgage interest deduction. That's a similar kind of philosophy at stake. That you can understand that that may end up increasing revenue, but at the end of the day, it's also probably better tax policy.
It is better tax policy. You broaden the base and lower the rates, and that's exactly what has to be done, especially when you consider we've had the great stimulus experiment. It was called housing. We had easy monetary policy with artificially low interest rates. We had direct subsidies, first-time home buyer tax credits, the mortgage interest deduction, and, of course, we had the massive indirect subsidy of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This was a classic Robert Reich, Paul Krugman stimulus package, and look, for the love of all things sacred, what happened?
Right. No, no disagreement here.
And so you lower the rates and you broaden the base, and that means some people aren't going to get the carve-out that they like. I tend to agree with that, too, and it's something as a conservative I think we probably ought to support. Now, that might result, and here's where the rubber meets the road, that might result in higher revenue projections, and that's got some people very, very upset. Let's come back and talk about that right after this short, quick break. Okay, we are back. Last segment with Jonathan Bydlak. He's the president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending. Jonathan, where can people go to find out more about your organization?
Yeah, our website is the easiest spot, www.reducespending.org. Pretty straightforward. Pretty straightforward. You're trying to build a coalition, indeed, to reduce spending. That would be a good thing, because that really, in the final analysis, especially since we have been unleashed from the Jeffersonian constitutional chains that are the real answer to limiting spending, we now have to build a Democratic majority for reductions in spending and punish the politicians and make them understand that they're going to get punished if they don't vote to decrease spending. That's really the sea change we're talking about.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think we're actually closer than it may seem at times, especially as the economy stays in the tank, right? People are increasingly looking for answers to why we're having the problems that we're facing, and that again is why I think making this case that we need to reduce spending is such an important one.
How dire is the situation? The Obama administration has spent a good part of the last month or two blaming Bush. Well, let me be clear, good part of the last 3 years blaming Bush. And certainly there's a lot of blame to be leveled at a Republican president who let spending go up 80% in his term and saw a massive increase. Nevertheless, this president had control of the fiscal levers. In fact, earlier than most presidents, as you know, inside the Beltway talk here, in the appropriations process, the 2009 appropriations were only done for 6 months as Bush was leaving office. So Obama got to fashion the last 6 months of the 2009 budget. He enacted the stimulus plan in 2009. These guys have had control of the levers, and it's a total disaster with 30% increase in spending. How serious is this? And where I'm going with this is what Senator Rand Paul used to work for his dad, Ron, in 2008. And a lot of the Paulites out there are loath to embrace anybody but a Paul. But Senator Rand Paul says, look, we're in a mess here, and Romney's better than nothing. Where do you, and I'm not speaking for the coalition to reduce spending, but how do you feel about that?
Yeah, well, so the analogy I like to give with the Bush and Obama situation is that, it's like George Bush was playing blackjack and was dealt a 16 and said, hit me, and gets dealt a face card and busts. And, then Barack Obama comes into office and says, he gets dealt a 16 as well. And he says, don't worry, I'm different. Let's double down.
Right.
And, that's not actually, of course, being different. That's just doing more of the same to an even greater degree.
Right, exactly.
To your question on Romney, I mean, my feeling is that, again, I have no... It is very hard to know how someone's actually going to act until they're in office, right? I mean, the problem, of course, that everyone knows about Romney is that many times he says good things, but on the other side, the coin, he's oftentimes saying different things to different people. So, I would be a little bit optimistic in the sense that I think that he has a business acumen, and he sort of has spent his life in kind of that problem solver sort of role. And so perhaps when he's sort of in the position to really have to do something about the looming debt crisis, I think that he might be more willing than others might be to sort of view it from that kind of perspective rather than the sort of clouded by the ideology. But,
I'm kind of with you on that.
That's really hard to say.
It is hard to say, but I'm kind of with you on that. He prides himself in turning around failed businesses, so he's running as a turnaround man. He's going to be a one-termer real quick. If he doesn't do it, at least come up with some sort of outward progression of a surplus. More importantly, though, if you take a look at a guy like Chris Christie, who was the moderate in the New Jersey gubernatorial race, how many years have we been sold down this Rhino River where we're told, oh, this guy's a conservative? In Bush's case, he's not like his dad. He's a real true blue conservative because Bush 41 was a big spender too. And you look at Ford and you look at Nixon and even Reagan, although I give him a little bit of a pass, we're in the heart of the Cold War. Nevertheless, you take a look at these guys who say they're conservatives, and then they get in there and they drift, they tack left, and spending goes up. Maybe we just ought to go in here with eyes wide open and say, this guy's clearly not a conservative in the mold that I would like, but he may surprise us like a Chris Christie has done and go in there as a moderate and tack a little bit right.
Yeah, I think that's possible, right? I mean, again, I think regardless of what your own political persuasion is, right, when you're faced with sort of the numbers that we're talking about, then your options are pretty limited, and so. He hasn't said that he's going to go and cut $1 trillion, and as a matter of fact, he's been very hesitant about saying that. But
right.
Who knows, right? When he's
trying to get elected,
right? When he's in office and and is confronted with the reality that oh my God, this is a really crazy problem, right? I mean, you got to believe, given his background with Bain, that he's been in that kind of situation like that before, although perhaps not even this bad. And so, but again, like I said, I'm very lukewarm in that regard, just because it's it's very difficult to know exactly.
What I can't figure out is, I understand, privately of Romney saying, I'm going to go in there and cut spending, but I'll be damned if I'm going to say it on the campaign trail because I'll be pilloried and I won't win, and I want to win. I get that. He privately admits it has to be done. I'm just I'm speculating here. What I don't get are the true believers who think you can spend your way out of this, the Krugmans and the Reiches and apparently the Obama administration. Seriously, what planet are these people on?
Yeah, but like I said, that's clearly the minority, right? When you, and this is one area where fiscal conservatism has or is winning the battle, right? People on a gut level understand very clearly that that doesn't make sense, and so you can. You're always going to have, people who are shouting from the rooftops with things that are frankly pretty extreme views, in my opinion, right? When you look at some of the people who are most knowledgeable on this topic, and I think about someone like David Walker, right, who's generally a political independent,
right,
who has been in a position, to really,
former controller, yeah,
right, exactly. This is a guy who doesn't really have any sort of political, motivations at all. And yet here he is, making a movie literally saying, we're heading off the fiscal cliff. And so, again, I think anyone who's pretty much reasonable on this issue, understands that. Well,
that would rule out Krugman.
Yeah, but the stuff that Paul Krugman of the world are talking about is just kind of,
not only is it wacky, but you look at the empirical data. From an economist's perspective, he has been so wrong so many times. His predictions, we just got to do this, we got to do this, we do it, and what happens? It's just absolutely astounding. And I hope we've reached that critical mass that the Coalition to Reduce Spending says we have, and we're starting to see this paradigm shift where Americans are going to punish politicians not for bringing home the bacon, but for voting for the bacon. And that would be refreshing because it has to happen. And that means every American needs to look in the mirror and say, if I'm getting a government check, I'm going to do with less.
Yeah, I mean, we're really optimistic. I mean, we're, like I said, we're working on putting candidates on record, and I can tell you that, while we haven't announced all of our pledge signers yet. We have one signer who's a Democrat. We have another one who's an independent. And we haven't made this public yet. I'll let you know that you might be pleased to know that one of your Senate candidates, Kurt Bills, has actually taken the pledge and signed. And so, I think that again, there are the good signs, right?
Good signs out there, you bet. Hey, Jonathan Bydlak, president of the Coalition to Reduce Spending. That's reducespending.org. Thanks so much. Very intriguing hour.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me out.
Folks, see you tomorrow for more. It's Wednesday Hump Day on the Jason Lewis Show, and your calls as well. So have a great night. See you then.